Welcome to the CEC Report. It's 14th of March. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm with CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, with the Cheneyacs running American foreign policy, the intention is war. Australian bankers know a property collapse is a 10 on the Richter scale scenario. Nothing survives. And finally, bail-in legislation for Australia still pending. What's in it? So first, with the Cheneyacs running American foreign policy, the intention is war. And Craig, we're going to continue reporting on the Ukraine crisis because this is the scenario unfolding that we've warned about for 2 years, right? And it's getting more intense. But I just want to give, we try and report here what people, the Australian audience, would not have a hope of hearing anywhere else. So, for example, what I want to cover today is pose the question: which side is escalating this crisis? Let me report two things.
That would be from the Western media. That's Putin. Putin's putting troops in.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. Putin's the big bogey.
Putin's a monster.
Here.
He's a dictator. And he's trying to restore the Soviet Union. Blah blah blah.
Yeah. Russia has imperial designs. Right.
Yeah.
All these sorts of things, and this is all part of the big lie that most of the people in Australia will be believing out of their following the Western media.
Well, when it comes to the question of an escalation, though, this is where it gets quite serious because, okay, if things just stopped where they are now, the world could probably live with that. But when something is escalating, that's when you get very nervous about what we've been warning about, because military escalations can often not know when to stop. And both sides in this conflict have enormous nuclear weapons arsenals, and that's a background reality here. And so you've got to look, okay, what are the escalating points? Let me just report two things that have happened in the last 48 hours. The White House announced that NATO, which is the European American military pact, they're now conducting military exercises in Poland and with the Bulgarian and Romanian navies on the Black Sea. And for those who've been looking at the map for once of the world because of this, and you see where Crimea is, that's a peninsula into the Black Sea, right? That's where Russia's naval base is, in Crimea. And so NATO military exercise with Romania and Bulgaria, Navy exercise in the Black Sea, is meant to send Russia a message.
It's also sending the West a message, or to the gullible viewers of the West a message, that we're prepared to push this to war.
So what's Russia done the last 48 hours? Well, what you wouldn't know is this. Kiev, the interim government in Kiev, whom Russia does not recognise because they came to power in a coup against an actually democratically elected government, nevertheless, they have requested a flyover of Russian territory under a policy that most countries in the world agree to called the Open Skies policy, where so the Kiev government can see for itself where Russia's troops are, and Russia has agreed to that. Because
they've got nothing to hide, Robbie.
They've got nothing to hide. The media is saying there's 220,000 Russian troops amassed on the border, and Russia's saying no, they're not.
220,000. Do you know how many troops that is?
220,000.
That's a lot of troops.
That's a lot of troops. So you can't hide them, right? And Russia's saying, okay, fly over and have a look. So that is an act of good. That's trying to de-escalate the situation, whereas the West is trying to escalate this.
You're not just going to have a bunch of stick figures standing out in the middle of nowhere. There's going to be trucks, tents, all sorts of support infrastructure, Robbie. So when you're talking about 220,000 troops, you're talking about massive internal military infrastructure. Now that would have already been noticed without the flyovers.
Of course. And so Russia is saying, don't believe our denials, have a look yourself. But here's the thing. When you look at the two actions, you can see which side is escalating. Well, let me give you an example of how this could escalate, because this week on Rupert Murdoch's Fox News, now Rupert Murdoch, bear in mind, is one of the world's leading neocon war agitators. His media empire is personally responsible for the Iraq war, because without the propaganda they provided, it wouldn't have happened, right? And they provided they did all the demonisation of Saddam, not to necessarily defend Saddam, but they deliberately printed stuff that they just made up, like Saddam having a human shredding machine and all this kind of stuff. Saddam's soldiers killed babies for fun, all this kind of stuff, that demonised him in the eyes of the West, the way that the West is demonising Putin now, right? And I remember 10 years ago, Murdoch's Herald Sun newspaper here in Melbourne, calling Putin Hitler. 10 years ago, right? When there was no foundation for any of that. So on his main propaganda channel in America, Fox News, who should emerge from his crypt, dust the blood from his fangs to have a speak? None other than Dick Cheney, right? The former Vice President of the United States. And he demanded, not just NATO be in Poland, he demanded that NATO move troops into Ukraine itself and conduct military exercises on the border of Russia, right? Now this guy, when he's demanding this, he wants a war. Just as his faction wanted that Iraq war at all costs. Nothing was going to get in their way. They want this war.
He also was pushing for a war against Iran when he was in there.
Exactly.
And we published numerous new citizens down here demanding, Dick Cheney's ouster, his impeachment, get rid of this guy because he's trying to create World War III, that time through Iran.
So anyone with the modicum of a memory of the last decade knows this man and knows what a dangerous person he is. We, in this publication, Craig, that we put out because of this crisis a few weeks ago, World Financial Collapse Looms, British Empire Prepares Nuclear War, we took the origins of this back to something that Malcolm Fraser echoed in his own way the other week, which is a memo that Dick Cheney, when he was the Defence Secretary under George Bush Sr., in 1992, he issued a memo called a Draft Planning Guidance for Coming Decades, and in that memo he said, quote, "Our strategy must now refocus on precluding the emergence of any potential future global competitor," end quote. Now, at that time, Senator Joseph Biden, who's now the Vice President, he attacked Cheney's memo as, quote, "a plan for literally a Pax Americana, an American empire," end quote. Right, so this is Cheney's view of the world. America has to do what it must do to stay as a sole superpower world and push anyone else down.
There's a lot of people, Robbie, that say, yes, America's the problem. But just think, this is the British Empire dressed up in American clothing.
Yep.
And this is the policies that are driving this are British free trade, British globalisation, the British monetary system, and also British policies for global depopulation. Now that's what is actually driving this particular policy towards war, and there's enough lunatics in the British oligarchy that would want to push the world to extinction through these sorts of policies, and that's the kernel of the essence of the policy behind this. It's a British policy with American clothing.
Well, because essentially, Craig, not to have to explain every detail of it, but so long as Wall Street is in charge of the United States, that is Britain. Wall Street is an outpost of London, and it's like the demon. The British is like a demon possessing the United States.
Just quickly, Rob, just so people don't get a sense that we're just. I think they have to look at this question of look at John F. Kennedy. He had the Atoms for Peace program. Look at what Franklin Roosevelt did before him, right, in terms of challenging the British Empire. His hatred towards this whole what he called the 19th century methods, right? Yep. So you have this current within American history that has this idea of national sovereignty at the forefront of developing sovereign nation states. That current has been suppressed within the United States, and the British faction has taken over.
Well, and let's give some specific examples of that in this policy, Craig, that's causing a crisis in Ukraine. So Cheney is no longer in government, right? But it turns out that the people who worked for him when he was in government to deliver his agenda are still running American foreign policy today, specifically this Ukraine policy, and the key person is Victoria Nuland, who is the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. Now, we have made her quite a celebrity in recent weeks. This is the woman who, for those viewers who are watching this on Channel 31, you can go to our YouTube site and see past episodes just in the last month of the CEC Report, and you'll see the footage of the audio of Victoria Nuland conspiring with the Ukrainian American ambassador to plan the next government, which is what's in place now. And so she's the woman notorious for that. She's the woman we showed last week bragging that America has spent $5 billion to take Ukraine into the European Union, etc. Right?
Promoting democracy.
In the name of democracy, but working with these neo-Nazis to do it. Turns out, this woman worked as the long-time aide to Vice President Dick Cheney. She was his aide for a long time, right, while he was the Vice President. Furthermore, she is married to one of America's most well-known neoconservatives. And the neoconservatives is the name for the cult of, they're not even idealists, they're utopians, Lyndon LaRouche used to call them, who had this idea of a dominant empire for the world, but as
Pax
we said,
Americana.
Pax Americana. His name's Robert Kagan, and he's one of the co-founders in 1997 of a think tank called the Project for the New American Century, PNAC, or PNAC they call it. And essentially this PNAC was committed to Pax Americana, and it is the source, Craig, for those who remember the Iraq War. This think tank was the source of the preemptive strike doctrine, which was the idea America announced a new doctrine: we reserve the right to preemptively attack any nation that has the potential to be a military or economic rival, aimed at Russia and China blatantly, right? Especially China in those days, because when they first put this up, Russia was a basket case. Russia has come back under Putin, right? And that's why they've started targeting it. And this economic rival thing is the key. And I remember Condoleezza Rice, Bush's National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. She'd always say in her speeches that America's interest is freedom and free markets.
Which is going back to the
Right?
British.
No, exactly. And when I remember when George Bush used to talk about freedom, he'd always talk about free markets. This latest Executive Intelligence Review, which people can call in and get a copy of if they'd like, March 14, 2014, mention that if you call in for it. We profile this guy, Robert Kagan. He wrote a book called The World America Made, which boasts that America is modelled on the British Empire, exactly as Craig's been talking about, and that includes forcing, and I'll give you the quote in a minute, forcing free trade onto countries. This is the quote. So the free market, free trade economy was not adopted willingly and gratefully everywhere. Americans, and Britons before them, might believe that the free market, free trade system provided developing nations with the opportunity to get richer. But as one scholar, Robert Gilpin, observed, those opportunities nevertheless had to be imposed upon the reluctant partners. Free trade is the policy of the strong. End quote.
Free trade is the policy of the British gunboats enforcing slavery.
Opium onto China.
Opium onto China. And that is the policy we're talking about here. There is nothing different. All that's being used today is the banking policies of British monetarism, armies of NATO, right, directed towards intimidating Russia, and of course you've got.
Well, specifically, Craig, these guys are. We're showing how ideological they are, right? Mm-hmm. This is the driver for war, though, because Russia and China are not willing to have this imposed on them.
That is the essence of it, right? Because look, this policy of British free trade is a proven policy of slavery, economic slavery. Putin knows this. Why? Because in 2000, Putin was responsible for turning around the policies that were killing 1 million Russians per year. The policies that had looted Ukraine and looted Russia to the bone. He came in and says, we're not going to have any more of this, and he had to fight the British-backed oligarchs of Russia, and he had to put in place the policies in order to save the physical economy of Russia. Now, it's nowhere, there's still problems in this, right? But this is the essence of what's going on here. The imposition of British free trade, even by gunboats, or this time, de facto NATO or America.
So, and our side, that's what people have to understand, it's our side, our allies who are the ideologues and therefore the offenders in this process. But we've definitely run out of time for that segment, Craig. We've got to take a break. When we come back, we'll switch to the Australian economy. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Australian bankers know a property collapse is a 10 on the Richter scale scenario. Nothing survives. Craig, last week we reported about the special visit to Australia of Daisuke Kotagawa, who is a top Japanese banking official from the Ministry of Finance there. And I accompanied him in Canberra, and I just want to report a very telling thing that happened. A high-level official claimed to us that people have been warning for ages that the property bubble will collapse, and it hasn't, right? And then he said, authorities in Australia have stress tested the banks for a 40% of house prices collapse, 40%, and they all survive in that stress test scenario. So I asked him later, I asked Kotagawa later what he thought of that, and his response straight away is stress testing is macroeconomic garbage, because he dealt with actual banks collapsing following a property collapse. He knows what it is. When we asked actual bankers, we got to meet some bankers, and when we just mentioned this in passing, they nearly fainted. The idea that you could have a 10% property collapse, let alone a 40% one. They know everything in Australia hinges on that. If that property market collapses, the whole system in Australia will be wiped out. And I want to highlight 3 graphs that we'll put on the screen. The first graph shows the concentration of Australia's financial system in just 4 banks, so that what the percentage of the financial system that 4 banks in Australia represent is higher than any other country. So the top 4 banks in every other country, what they have, compared to what the top 4 banks in Australia has, and our concentration is close to 80%, right? The very highest, and we've mentioned that. So you see the comparison though, that's key. The second graph shows that Australian banks have far more of their loans in real estate than any country, and by a long margin. You compare it to Norway, Canada, the US, Denmark, etc. Over 60% of the bank's businesses in real estate, right? So they are completely exposed. So concentrated banks, all exposed to one sector of the economy, mortgages. And then of course the third graph shows actual house prices as a comparison of related countries, the UK, Australia, Canada, and look at it, right? And also look though, you see the top 2 lines are Australia and the US. The US collapsed after 08, Australia didn't, but look at 08, we were on the same level as the US. So everyone knows America had a bubble. That's a bubble, it's a bubble, it's a bubble, right? That's why it collapsed. Oh, but we don't have a bubble, right? So anyway, this is nuts. Daisuke Kotagawa made a point to the people he was talking to. He said, the banks that are lending into property, this lending is not actual lending, it's speculation, right? And there's a lot of derivatives. The derivatives graphs we highlight, those derivatives are based on that speculation, right? So what that has become is a black hole for the economy. All the available credit gets absorbed into there. If you have a Glass-Steagall, what you do is you cut the speculating in banks off from the fuel for their speculation, which is deposits. They can't use those deposits for that speculation. Put in place a Glass-Steagall, and if they can't do that, then what you do is you have a lot more credit available in the economy for lending, normal, proper lending into farming, into small businesses, etc. The very areas of the economy that are being starved out now because it's all being absorbed into this black hole. So that was a very valid point he made. My question to you though is, it's quite straightforward, but isn't it easier to implement such a Glass-Steagall between crises than during one?
Well, obviously, Robbie, you're not dealing with the panic factor. Look, the problem's known. I mean, the bankers that we've met with, the government officials that we've met with, they know what the problems are. In fact, some of the meetings they came prepared to argue what we'd already been putting out in the public in a big way, because they know that we're right in what we've been saying about the property bubble being such an explosive detonator for the crash of the system. The problem is with Glass-Steagall, it's so straightforward. Get rid of the speculation, re-regulate the banking system, and then fund, through national credits, large-scale infrastructure development projects into the physical economy. Now, we've written a lot about this. We have put a pamphlet out now called Glass-Steagall Now, which is available if people call in for that. And that particular magazine goes through the detail of this.
Yeah. And for those, just before we go to a break, a point for those who saw this show last week, Craig, with the report on Kotagawa and how well he cleaned up Japan's banks, a point I didn't make at the time is at the time Japan had Glass-Steagall, which made it possible for him to do that cleanup, whereas in 2008 when America couldn't do it, they didn't have Glass-Steagall. Right. All right, when we come back, we're going to talk about bail-in. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, bail-in legislation for Australia is still pending, but what's in it? So, Craig, the other thing that happened on our trip last week to Canberra is we confirmed that the bail-in legislation that we've been warning about, that we picked up off from the official documents between the Financial Stability Board in Switzerland and the G20 Secretariat, that legislation is still being prepared, right? However, officially, all that's being admitted about it is the legislation is to legislate so that banks are, in a sense, made to issue what they call bail-inable bonds, which will be bonds, and a bond is when you lend something to a bank or a government, bonds that the investor knows in advance will be bailed in. They will lose that money if the bank is in danger of failing and they need to grab that money to keep it going, right? So bail-inable bonds. So that's the official story. Here's the problem. The public is being asked to accept that on faith because the legislation isn't public. It hasn't been made public, and that's a bit hard to do because we know from other jurisdictions, we know from New Zealand, and you go to the New Zealand Reserve Bank's website, how they boast about how everyone's deposits are up for grabs. And we know from Europe, right, that bail-in those jurisdictions is to include depositors, right? And remember the European Commission last year declared that Cyprus, what happened in Cyprus, is now the template for all of Europe. So we don't really have any grounds to accept it on faith. And there's another thing that has to be asked. If they expect us to believe that all this means is bail-inable bonds, the question is, who would buy bail-inable bonds?
Well, you and I wouldn't, Robbie, but there's $1.5 trillion in superannuation funds. So
where the account holders wouldn't have any idea where it's being used.
That's right. So where do you think this money is going to come from? It's going to come from people's superannuation funds that are in accounts that they don't really understand, that are going to be, I mean, these bail-inable bonds are going to have to attract an interest rate higher than just normal bonds.
They'll be at a premium.
There's a risk factor involved in these,
so
which is that they can get stolen.
So you'll get your super account and think, oh boy, this bond investment I've made is a pretty good one.
Right, until the point that the property market collapses by 15 or 20%, right, the banks are insolvent, and what are they going to grab? Well, right now they can't grab the people's deposits because they're under, the way the Australian law is, you can't do that quite just yet. But that doesn't mean that this legislation that they're bringing in to create bailable bonds is not going to begin the stepping stone to grab all deposits.
Yep.
And that's the key here, is that once you start letting this idea come in, right, instead of having a Glass-Steagall where you re-regulate the entire system so you don't allow this sort of speculation or problem to happen because you guarantee the system by the proper sorts of regulation, then you're going to allow this sort of rot to creep in, initially through bail-inable bonds, and then, oh, we don't have enough, and then they'll keep going, and so forth, and so on, until we're at a point where any deposits in any of the Australian banks are going to be up for grabs. Yep. You can just see the scenario, and it's all going to be taken on faith. Oh, we're never going to do this, you know. Well, there's so many things that politicians say they will never do, right, then they renege on because there's been some sort of extreme crisis happen, right, that people just end up wearing it.
They might tag it through on the bill that raises the GST to 15%.
The solution is Glass-Steagall, re-regulate the banking system, protect people's deposits from the point of view of a strong banking system that's not run by bankers, but run by people who want to have a strong banking system.
Yeah. All right, well, Craig, thank you very much. That's it for this week's CEC Report. Thanks for tuning in, and tune in next week for more.